From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Monday, May 27. An embarrassing defence secret is out in the open. Australia had almost no submarines available to defend the country between 2009 and 2012, even as China was aggressively expanding its navy. That's an exclusive live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Missing mother Bronwin Winfield was given legal advice just before she disappeared in 1993 that she was entitled to a significant share of assets from her failed marriage. Husband John Winfield was the last person to see Bronwyn alive, but he says she chose to leave him and their young daughters. He's never been charged and denies any wrongdoing. It's all part of the gripping cold case being investigated in The Australian's new podcast Bronwyn, available now at bronwynpodcast.com. Compulsory national service for all 18-year-olds. That's the bold policy UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is staking his future on. It's the billionaire versus the silk, as barrister Keir Starmer tries to bring Labor back. Stay with us.
Over the next few weeks, I will fight for every vote. I will earn your trust.
Standing outside 10 Downing Street, getting soaked in the rain, stoically refusing to hold an umbrella or even wear a raincoat. That's the image Rishi Sunak created for voters as he announced Britain is going to the polls on July 4. It's his bid to extend the Conservatives' 14-year reign for one more term. As Sunak got drenched, a nearby loudspeaker started playing the opposition's anthem. Things can only get better.
China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology. And migration is being weaponised by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders.
You might have thought sopping Sunak looked resilient, or just a bit of a drip.
I have to say I took the slightly more conventional view that whoever in Rishi Sunak's communications team didn't bother to look at the sky or their weather app should be sacked.
Richard Ferguson is the Australian's National Chief of Staff. As you can hear, he's also a Scotsman, and he's spent a lifetime immersing himself in British politics.
That would have worked, that scene of him in the rain, if it had been a stronger speech, but it was not a strong speech. It was pretty flat. He looked like a dejected man who knew he was going to lose an election in a landslide. People in his cabinet had no idea he was going to call an election. And it was a surprise he called it, considering he's about 14 to 20 points behind in the polls.
Richard is a politics junkie, and he likes things to be done properly. So he was horrified when it emerged over the weekend Sunak had broken the first rule in political campaigning, resting.
Look, he had taken a day off, to which the joke had become, well, this might be a bad day for Labour because Rishi Sunak isn't out campaigning making mistakes.
He's had a tough first week. He was photographed in front of an exit sign. He visited the shipyard where the Titanic was built, prompting lots of gags about sinking ships. And he watched scores of his own MPs quit.
Tonight, one of the Prime Minister's most senior cabinet ministers is calling it a day. Michael Gove, an influential...
But then Rishi Sunak came out with a blinder of a policy, which is compulsory national service for everyone aged 18 in Britain. Basically, they will get to choose between 12 months in the military or their weekend doing volunteering, firefighter, ambulance, that kind of thing. So that would be the first time since the early 50s that they have national service. I mean, he needs something, so he might as well try a couple Hail Marys.
The other idea Sunak really needs to work is migration policy. He wants to send illegal immigrants who attempt to enter the UK via the English Channel to Rwanda.
Rishi Sunak himself on day one, which didn't help his bad campaigning streak, said that there would be no flights to Rwanda before July the 4th when the election will be held. He says it will only happen if a Conservative government wins. So he won't have the image of sending anybody off. But the problem he was going to have is, what if flights left in September to Rwanda, but the small boats just kept on coming across the English Channel? He couldn't risk the policy being seen as a failure.
There have been 5 Conservative PMs since 2010, and they've instituted immense reforms through education to health and social policy. But they've stumbled by seeming entitled and out of touch. First, David Cameron, who gambled and lost on Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union. Cameron called the referendum, pleading with Britons to stay in the EU.
The British people have spoken and the answer is, we're out.
And I think the almost 7 years of his premiership were kind of thrown away in that one instance.
Cameron quit and Theresa May stepped up. But May was slow to respond to the dreadful 2017 Grenfell Tower public housing fire, where 72 people died.
The warnings this building was a fire trap apparently went unheard, but it was impossible to miss the screams of those begging to be saved from it.
And she couldn't get her own MPs to agree on how the EU breakup should be handled.
She just didn't have the charisma and she didn't have the control of her party to succeed, and it was left to Boris.
Boris, the brilliant, deeply flawed scruff bag who had successfully convinced the British the EU was to blame for all their problems.
He was definitely the most consequential of those 5 prime ministers, Claire, and probably the most consequential prime minister, definitely since Blair, although you could make a very strong argument since Thatcher. He got them out of the European Union. He led them through the coronavirus pandemic. I think there's no doubt that Boris Johnson had extraordinary leadership when it came to backing Ukraine. In the months leading up to the war,
this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Boris Johnson is a hero in Ukraine, and rightly so. But then there was the other side of Boris, Claire. There was the struggle with the truth. There was the chaos.
Shut up a minute.
During lockdowns, it turns out that his entire staff in Downing Street were constantly having parties when other people, couldn't go to the funeral of their parents.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise.
His operation was chaos, and so he was steamrolled by his party, basically. He was only left with a couple of ministers and he had to go. But a lot of those ministers now say they wish they'd never done it because then they got Liz Truss.
You'd be forgiven for saying who? Because Liz Truss's prime ministership only lasted 50 days and featured a wildly ambitious economic plan that crashed markets and sent interest rates soaring. Perhaps her most memorable moment was visiting Queen Elizabeth II at home in Balmoral and posing for what turned out to be the last formal photo of the Queen.
I think there's a great irony, Claire, that the late Queen's first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, maybe the greatest Briton who ever lived, definitely the greatest British Prime Minister, the man who won the Second World War and stopped Hitler.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
And then her last Prime Minister was the shortest serving and probably the worst Prime Minister Britain ever had.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
She's written in her recent book that, she said, why is this happening to me? To which point most prime ministers go, well, it's actually an incredible opportunity to lead your nation in, kind of darkness. But she did it very woodenly. She had no charisma. She had radical policies that most of her party thought went way too far. It's okay to do Reaganomics if you're the world's currency, but it doesn't really work when you're Britain and you're about number 7.
And that led us to Rishi Sunak, who shares with his wife a fortune of just over $1 billion Australian dollars.
I think that Rishi Sunak deserves a lot of credit for fixing a lot of the economic mess he was left with by Liz Truss in such a short period of time. Inflation has come down to target band just in the past week, which is why some people think he called this election.
It's a huge gamble. Will Britons thank Sunak for fixing the mess or punish him for the years of chaos?
He has a reputation for being quite tetchy and for not really getting why everybody doesn't love him. He's just not that good at politics.
Coming up, the man who's carrying Labour's hope of kicking out the Tories. If you haven't already caught Hedley Thomas's new podcast, Bronwin, it's a new cold case from the journalist who created The Teacher's Pet. Episodes 1 and 2 of Bronwin are free to listen for registered users right now at bronwinpodcast.com.
Teach me not a thing, can only get better.
Things Can Only Get Better by D. Ream. That was UK Labour's theme song for the 1997 election when Tony Blair swept to power. Now there's a new Labour hope, Sir Keir Starmer KC, a former Crown prosecutor and human rights barrister, the son of a nurse and a factory worker.
Over the course of the last 4 years, we've changed the Labour Party, returned it once more to the service of working people.
Starmer wants to slash public health waiting times, create a new border security command, set up a publicly owned green energy firm paid for by a tax on oil and gas, and recruit thousands of new teachers. But so far, there's no big vision for sweeping change.
I think our cousin at the Times, the great Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein, put it really well recently, in which he said, Keir Starmer's message at this election is Britain is broken, let's do nothing about it.
Starmer stumbled over the issue of the trans community, struggling to answer questions like, what is a woman? All the while, he was battling to get rid of the forces of former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, a hardcore left-winger who'd promised to rip up the Brexit deal and nationalise the railways.
He has really brought them back to the centre, saying that they would stick by, for example, Tory spending rules, which would lead to some big cuts in the future. He's, repaired the relationship with business. He has really done a fantastic job of making the Labour Party an electable alternative of the classic centrist kind of Hawke, Keating, Clinton, Blair kind of way. Gaza has been the big problem for Keir Starmer. He has done so much, Claire, to try and separate his party from the party of Jeremy Corbyn, which had some of the worst conspiracy theorists, anti-Semites you could imagine, kind of near his centre of power. But there's a lot of British Labour MPs with huge Muslim constituencies who feel very strongly on the issue of Palestine. Because he's so far ahead, it hasn't really been a problem in opposition, but I think it will become a huge problem for him in government, especially if he gets a large majority where he has a lot of left-wing MPs that essentially act as the real opposition. A bit like Tony Blair faced during the Iraq War when left-wing MPs were constantly voting against him on the Iraq War. But he does have this general problem that he's basically trying to say nothing in order to not scare the horses and get in, and that doesn't always work, especially in an election campaign.
Richard Ferguson is the Australian's National Chief of Staff. Thanks for joining us on The Front. If you like the show, give us 5 stars wherever you listen. And don't forget to join our subscribers at theaustralian.com.au and be the first to know.